Real estate photos don't always benefit from the same sharpening techniques that are used for other genres of photography. Instead, by applying certain adjustments in the right order, you can make highly impactful images with a higher quality as well, and that's what this episode's all about. For those who don't know me, my name is Nathan Kuhl. I'm a professional real estate photographer in Southern California. I've shot literally thousands of homes. I've had a lot of practice on editing my own photos and knowing what really does make them sharp. And it's different from other genres in that it's not necessarily the sharpening itself that needs the most attention. This is something that stuns a lot of new real estate photographers because real estate photography is a unique type of photography, shooting a very large area with a mix of sometimes very difficult light. So what I'm going to be doing in this episode is twofold. First, I'm going to be explaining some of the quick science behind sharpening, how that's actually being applied to the sharpening techniques that you're likely very familiar with, but how that then applies when we try to do sharpening on real estate photos and the steps then that are involved with getting them sharp, including all the adjustments that you would be doing in the editing process. So let's take a look at that, starting from the top. We're all familiar with sharpening sliders, like the ones used in Lightroom here, where you'd be dragging this back and forth, maybe adding some masking into it. But these are the last thing you should use during your editing workflow, doing real estate photography, and for good reason. What we perceive as sharpness is actually a matter of contrast, and here's why. Sharpening algorithms are based on this. It's called a rise distance. It's a matter of finding edges with a gradient of contrast. That's what's shown in this graph. This represents, in this case, an abrupt change in contrast from black to white, which corresponds to this image. This black and white image has a very high contrast between two edges. That, though, is just conceptual, since in reality there is more of a gradient between the contrasting images, which has a longer rise distance like we can see in this graph. This is more realistic. So the longer the rise distance, the softer the gradient, which we perceive as being less sharp. The faster and the shorter the rise distance, then the sharper that it is. So sharpness algorithms find edges across your image within a certain given rise distance. It's the amount of sharpening that you want to apply, and then the software does nothing more than adjust the contrast between those two edges. Thus, when it comes to sharpening, it's all about contrast. Longer rise distance are common in ambient light, like in this particular ambient shot, and shorter rise distance are common in flash shots, like you can see here, just using flash. That's because ambient light is more diffuse than flash, and so ambient light is softer. It has longer rise distances. That's why when you're shooting flash, those flash shots pop, because they have a shorter rise distance, and thus they have higher contrast between edges, which we then perceive as being sharper. It has higher sharpness to it. That's what we perceive. When we're doing flambient, when we finally blend the two together and add window pulls, whatever, the flambient portion of our editing workflow relies on some of the luminance from the ambient shots. So once you apply flambient blending, the areas with ambient luminance will be softer than in the flashed shot. So the less ambient you apply, the sharper your flambient images will be. This is one of the reasons why incorporating flash wherever you can is so much more important, but there's a lot more to it. And by the way, if you're not familiar with the flambient process, you can download my ebook on interior photography, which I have a link to in the description for this video. In any case, this loss of contrast from flambient blending and thus loss of sharpness will vary in some parts of the tonal range more than others, which is where the steps to sharpening need our attention. The first step in sharpening flambient images is to address contrast within specific regions of the tonal range, which is more flexible and accurate than just applying a global contrast and sharpening. While some global contrast helps, each image you edit will have different levels of tones and thus a different histogram. So instead of just applying global contrast and then increasing the sharpening slider, you want to tackle each individual tonal range first and then think about sharpening. Let's take a look at an example to see why. In this example, I applied the common post-processing preset that I talk about in my interiors book once you've done the flambient blending in Photoshop, and then you brought it back into Lightroom, but this is just a starting point. In fact, I needed to adjust the sliders a little bit differently. Applying that preset, if I were to do that using the standard bump, which was down here in the history, you can see that it just made the image too bright. Once again, these are just starting points, but this is the standard preset. If you want to jot this down for post-processing, it's just right here in the basic panel. You can see I set contrast to 10. I dropped the highlights to -75. The shadows, they're at +60. Whites are +25. Blacks, -45, and clarity 10. You can add some geometry in there, like doing your verticals or whatnot if you want to, but these are the most critical ones. But you can see though that it's really not the best for this image. It's too bright, and that is a sign that we adjusted contrast incorrectly. Once again, it's just a starting point, but it's not the best contrast for this image, thus it's not going to have the best sharpness to it. This particular space has a lot of white paint, and that's making it so bright, so the whites need to be toned down. Also, the shadows shouldn't be so high here either. So if we go back to where we had done the adjustments, you can see here by toning down the shadows a little bit, the whites aren't quite as high, and the blacks were just a little bit higher too. We get a more impactful image, something that's more realistic than if we just applied that bump to it. Once that's done, we can go to the sharpening, which was in the history here, but there's more to it than just that. We have to first concentrate on what we're doing here with this individual contrast. And in this case, it was so important that we adjusted whites and blacks first, because these are at the far ends of the tonal range, and this will become then the first areas to look at, so you can get control based on the overall tone of your image, if it's very bright or very dark. Blacks, though, are different, like in this image that is dominated by dark tones from the kitchen cabinets and the chairs. Notice how, in this case, the black slider, that's very far off from our normal standard preset. So also notice that it's close to being where the whites slider is. So on the opposite end though, they're always going to be opposing to get contrast. If we applied the standard post-processing preset, and we just went up here and did that, then we'd see it doesn't look so bad. You can see everything's there, but we brought out a lot more detail than what we wanted to in the cabinets. And we can think that, well, that's probably because the shadows are so high. We increased the shadows, that's going to bring out the grain in the wood. But it's more than that. The problem isn't just that the shadows are high, the shadows are overcompensating for this really low blacks value. We shouldn't have the blacks that low. Instead, what we should do in this case, the shadows should really only be probably at about 20. And then if we take our whites, keep them at 25, but take the blacks to -20 instead of -45, you can see we have now a richer looking image. It's well toned, it's still well exposed. If we go back in our history though, this is where the bump was applied. This is where we did this, so the exposure stayed the same, but we didn't just start fussing around. Have I got too many shadows in here? Do I need to bring down more highlights? The key to this is that once again, the far ends of the tonal range needed our attention. The far end of the tonal range that was impacting this image the most was the blacks region, since this is dominated by so many dark colors that are in the forefront of this image. So by adjusting the blacks, we could then decrease the shadows. It made a more realistic looking photo. So this is something you should practice and then think about applying to difficult interiors. What you do just for practice is to start fresh. So let's do that. Let's go down here to where we first just brought this in. This is straight out of doing the flambient blending. I'm going to first then just adjust some of the geometry real quick, and the verticals in this case works for this particular image. Doesn't always work that well in Photoshop. You know how to do that with your transform sliders. After applying that geometry, the next thing is just add a little bit of contrast. We'll add our typical 10 here. Now that just adds overall contrast to the image, which is going to be needed for the most part because these were just raw images to start with before the flambient blending. There always needs to be a little bit of contrast. Next is to adjust the whites and blacks so that we're now refining the contrast from the far ends of the tonal range. So bring up the whites a little bit, see how that starts to look, and it's not really doing much for this image because it's already fairly bright in the bright areas, so we can leave it maybe right about there, and then start bringing the blacks down and see where that goes. See where you're happy with it. You can see that if we went too far, it's so contrasty down here that that dark blue just is too blue. So we need to bring that up. And does it really need much more impact? Even right there at -20 seems to be just fine. Next, it's time to take a look at highlights and shadows. Once you have a well-contrasted image, then it's time to take a look at highlights and shadows. So first thing, let's bring down some of the highlights, which are always going to be a problem with interior photography, even using the flambient method, because of all the various lighting sources. So we'll bring highlights down and just see where that starts cutting out some of the excessive amount of ambient light, which really didn't need much here. Shadows the same way, bring it up the other direction, which adds contrast there, but we don't want to bring out any grain, just a little bit. You don't want to push the shadows too far. Once again, we can see that looks pretty good. Now, what we want to do is add clarity. So if you recall from the histogram, clarity is in the midtones, and when we were adjusting the whites and blacks, we were stretching those midtones away to the far ends of the tonal range. So now what we have left in those midtones are things that just can't get contrast. That's when you want to bring in clarity. And once again, a little bit usually works very well. If we put in a lot, you can see that what it's doing though is it's not hitting those really dark darks, it's not hitting the really bright brights, just those dull areas. For instance, here over top of the island, if you watch what's going here, those dull areas are starting to come out just a little bit. So that's where you want to add that clarity. And that's why clarity should be added last. Then, after you do all that, then there's one more step to sharpening, but there's a little bit more to take a look at. One other thing you can do at this point is consider adding texture if it would help. It needs to be done very carefully, but in cases like this, where there is texture within, for instance, the granite countertops, if you wanted to add a little bit of punch, you could add some texture, which texture slider in Lightroom is nothing more than just a refined clarity slider. It just gets more refined areas in the midtones, which helps when you're talking about granite and whatnot. Anyways, after you do this and just these basic adjustments up here by first addressing contrast properly, then it's time to look at sharpening. Now that you've adjusted contrast properly, added clarity and then texture if you needed to, it's time to consider sharpening if you still need it. So let's scroll down there and take a look. And if you'll notice here in this finished image, there was no sharpening added at all. We can zoom in here and we see that stuff still looks very sharp. So how much sharpening do I need? Probably none, actually. The reason being is that during the pre-processing step, when you import your photos into your raw files into Lightroom, it will apply a default amount of sharpening. Take any photo that you had brought in, for instance this one, you can see here's the default. This is like about a +40, no masking that was applied to it. When I import stuff for pre-processing, the pre-processing preset I use uses these sharpening values, which is less, just a little bit of sharpening at 30. And here's an important one, the masking is set to 30. And this is something that's often overlooked, is that using some masking, we're able to control better where the sharpening is applied. Let's say that we did want to sharpen our image at this point, just to make it a little sharper. Perhaps we can bring in a little bit more of the text to the Pellegrino bottles here, which really wouldn't matter for a real estate photo, but let's say that we want to do that. Well, what we can do is just add a little bit of sharpening first and then see how that will work with our masking. To do that, you want to first move the sharpening slider just a little bit to the right. The amount of sharpening at this point won't matter yet because what we want to do is see where it will be applied. That's done with the masking slider. While holding down your Alt key, start dragging the masking slider over and you start getting this white and black view. The white areas are what will be sharpened, the black areas won't be sharpened, and you get it to a point where you just want to do just the various fine edges. Let's stop there. We'll go in here to those Pellegrino bottles, and that looks pretty good. So we can now sharpen a little bit more if we wanted to. You can see it's not sharpening everything. Can refine that masking a little bit more just to where it's around there. So that looks really sharp. When we zoom out, nobody's really going to probably notice that, and you're going to risk another problem. If you sharpened your images before flambient blending, then you probably don't need to sharpen them again, because that will start raising the risk of pixelation, especially once your images are syndicated by the MLS or other listing sites. Each website like Zillow, Realtor.com, Redfin, they will all optimize your images for their platform, doing funky resizing that can get further pixelation into your images. But if you did want to add some sharpening and post-processing, do so with a high mask value by watching how that mask is applied. But above all else, before you attempt to sharpen an image, concentrate on contrast first by adjusting not just the contrast slider, but also the whites and blacks, then shadows and highlights, then clarity, and then texture if needed. Only after addressing contrast from all these other adjustments should you then consider sharpening at all, bearing in mind that contrast pops, while sharpening can risk doing more harm than good.